Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The following presentation explores the intricate historical landscape of American radio dramas, specifically focusing on how these early broadcasting narratives addressed, mirrored, and occasionally distorted the highly sensitive legal, cultural, and personal realities of marriage dissolution during the early to mid-20th century. This content is intended exclusively for educational, historical, and entertainment purposes. It does not, under any circumstances, constitute professional legal, psychological, financial, or relational advice. The laws surrounding marriage, legal separation, fault-based dissolution, and asset division vary profoundly by jurisdiction and have undergone drastic transformations since the golden age of radio. The historical trends, broadcasting case studies, and potential outcomes depicted in these vintage media formats do not reflect modern family law, current therapeutic practices, or contemporary legal standards. Viewers navigating their own personal, marital, or legal circumstances must conduct their own extensive due diligence and are strongly encouraged to consult with licensed legal professionals, qualified therapists, or registered family law practitioners in their respective states or countries. What if I told you that the modern American concept of a civilized separation, the very language we use in mediation rooms, couples therapy, and modern divorce proceedings today, was largely engineered by a handful of terrified radio executives in the 1930s who were desperately trying to sell laundry detergent without offending the Federal Communications Commission? Picture the scene. It is 1937. The United States is still caught in the suffocating grip of the Great Depression. Inside millions of modest American homes, the focal point of the living room is not a television, but a large glowing wooden box, a Zenith or a Philco radio, emitting a warm amber light and a faint crackle of static. Sitting around these radios are millions of American housewives, tuning in 5 days a week to listen to the daytime serials. These programs, famously sponsored by large household cleaning conglomerates, birthed the term soap opera. But behind the soothing voices of the announcers and the melodramatic organ music lay a massive, highly secretive cultural battle regarding the limits of free speech, the rigid moral codes of the era, and the reality of the American family. In the 1930s, the national divorce rate was a topic of profound cultural anxiety. The economic devastation of the era meant that many unhappy couples simply could not afford the exorbitant legal fees required to formally dissolve a marriage, leading to high rates of unofficial separation or suffocating domestic misery. Yet, despite this widespread reality, speaking the actual word divorce on a national network radio broadcast was strictly forbidden. The broadcasting codes of the era were draconian. Treating the sanctity of marriage with anything less than absolute reverence could result in immediate catastrophic consequences. A single complaint from a powerful religious league or a conservative moral watchdog group could lead to devastating FCC fines, widespread sponsor boycotts, the cancellation of a multi-million-dollar program, and the permanent blacklisting of the scriptwriters and voice actors involved. Faced with an audience that desperately craved authentic, relatable stories about domestic strife, but shackled by a censorship board that categorized legal marital dissolution alongside profanity and obscenity, American radio scriptwriters had to innovate. They could not explicitly state that a husband and wife were pursuing legal action to end their union. Instead, they invented a highly sophisticated, deeply psychological linguistic dance. They created what historical media scholars now refer to as the spoken divorce journey. This was a masterclass in conversational subtext. Rather than serving divorce papers, a radio wife would suddenly discuss taking a long, solitary, and permanent train trip to Reno, Nevada, citing her fragile health, a well-known cultural dog whistle of the time, as Reno was the migratory divorce capital of the United States. Rather than arguing about alimony or asset division, a couple would have a tense, 15-minute dialogue entirely about the tragic, necessary dismantling of their shared summer cottage, meticulously discussing who would take the antique clock and who would keep the porcelain china. The American listening public, incredibly astute and eager for representation, rapidly learned to read between the lines. When a lead character stared out a fictional window and softly noted that the foundation of their beautiful house was finally giving way and could no longer be repaired, millions of listeners understood exactly what was truly being said. The radio networks inadvertently created a national, coded vocabulary for domestic trauma. They trained an entire generation of Americans to communicate their deepest relationship failures through metaphor, silence, and proxy arguments. But this delicate balancing act could not last forever. There was a specific broadcast, a widely forgotten script aired in the late autumn of 1941, just weeks before the nation was plunged into the Second World War, that pushed this coded language so far to the edge of explicitness that it almost brought down an entire broadcasting network. How did this one specific broadcast shatter the unwritten rules of the daytime serial? And more importantly, how did this massive, decades-long linguistic cover-up permanently rewire the way American families articulate heartbreak, separation, and emotional boundaries, even in the 21st century? We are going to unpack the lost scripts, the terrified executives, the Foley artists who created the sounds of slamming doors, and the secret language that shaped the communication styles of previous generations, ultimately trickling down to shape your own understanding of relationship finality. This brings us to exactly what this deep-dive historical masterclass will solve for you today. In our current era, we are flooded with endless digital content regarding toxic relationships, conscious uncoupling, high-conflict legal battles, and celebrity divorces. We speak openly about domestic dissolution in a way that would have caused a 1930s radio censor to suffer a heart attack. However, to truly comprehend the modern landscape of relationship discourse, you must profoundly understand its foundational architecture. Many individuals struggle to communicate effectively during moments of relational crisis because they are unknowingly repeating the avoidant, coded scripts passed down through generations of media consumption. By engaging with this comprehensive historical analysis, you are going to acquire a powerful analytical lens. This solves a critical blind spot for anyone attempting to navigate modern media literacy, study the evolution of interpersonal communication, or comprehend the sociological shifts in American family dynamics. We will examine rigorous historical trends detailing how media shapes private reality. We will analyze specific, documented case studies of early broadcasting censorship and the ingenious methods writers used to bypass them. Furthermore, we will explore the potential outcomes of utilizing suppressed or highly coded language when attempting to resolve complex personal conflicts. You will learn how to identify the invisible historical scripts that still silently govern aspects of American domestic life. By the time we conclude this extensive journey through the archives of American radio, you will never listen to a conversation, a podcast, an argument, or a cinematic dialogue about a breakup the exact same way again. You will be equipped to detect the historical echoes of the spoken divorce journey in your everyday life, granting you a profound understanding of how the media of the past meticulously designed the conversations of the present. To understand how meticulous this design truly was, you have to grasp the sheer economic gravity of daytime radio during the 1930s and 1940s. It was an absolute monolith of American entertainment and corporate advertising. By the end of the decade, over 60 different serialized dramas were broadcast daily across the major networks. We are talking about tens of millions of dedicated daily listeners, the vast majority of whom managed the domestic household budget. The massive consumer goods companies that owned and sponsored these programs were not producing art for the sake of art. They were executing highly calculated psychological marketing strategies to sell soap flakes, laundry detergent, and baking powder. The financial stakes were astronomical. If a storyline offended the moral sensibilities of the listener or triggered the wrath of a conservative watchdog group, the audience did not simply change the dial. They engaged in widespread boycotts of the sponsor. Therefore, avoiding the scandal of an explicit marital separation was not merely a creative choice for these networks. It was a desperate economic necessity to protect million-dollar advertising accounts from instantaneous ruin. Imagine if right now, in the year 2026, you were tuning into your favorite streaming platform, and the content algorithms were governed by a strict federal mandate that no character could ever directly state they were breaking up with their partner. Imagine a modern listener named David, sitting in his autonomous vehicle commuting to his corporate office in 2026, listening to an audio drama where a couple navigates an agonizing, permanent separation communicated entirely through a vicious argument about a broken smart thermostat. David would likely find the dialogue completely absurd and unnecessarily cryptic. Yet, this was the absolute unyielding reality for scriptwriters under the iron fist of the broadcast censors of the early 20th century. They had to weave immense emotional stakes and life-altering relationship fractures into the most mundane domestic objects and daily routines. The kitchen sink, the garden fence, and the evening cup of coffee all became heavily loaded weapons in the spoken divorce journey. Let us examine a specific historical trend through a case study of early radio script mechanics to see exactly how this was executed. Take the narrative structure of wildly popular programs like The Romance of Helen Trent or Ma Perkins. In these daily broadcasts, writers faced a recurring and seemingly impossible problem. They needed the agonizing, relatable drama of a failing marriage to keep listeners desperately engaged day after day. But the strict broadcasting codes forbade any sympathetic portrayal of legal marital dissolution. To solve this, the writers employed the geographical proxy. Instead of a husband openly serving legal papers or announcing his departure, the scriptwriter would send him on an extended, highly ambiguous business trip to South America or Chicago. The abandoned wife would then have agonizing conversations with her neighbor not about the end of her marriage, but about the deeply delayed letters from her husband. The Postal Service became the accepted proxy for emotional and legal abandonment. The historical trends within these scripts show that the longer the delay in the fictional mail, the closer the characters were to a permanent, unspoken legal separation. The writers developed an incredibly sophisticated and rigid lexicon of replacements to bypass the censors. To discuss infidelity without triggering a network fine, they used the language of divided professional attention and extreme overwork. A husband straying from his marital vows was never caught in a physical affair. He was simply portrayed as suffering from a sudden, inexplicable obsession with his late-night bookkeeping at the corporate office. The other woman was never named as a homewrecker or an illicit lover. She was consistently introduced as a highly efficient young secretary whose meticulous organizational skills were suddenly entirely indispensable to the husband. The audience, sitting closely by their wooden console radios, decoded this subtext instantly. They understood on a cellular level that when the fictional wife complained bitterly about the new secretary reorganizing the office filing cabinet, she was actually expressing the devastating psychological reality of being permanently replaced in her own life. This is precisely where the American public first received mass daily training in the art of the passive-aggressive proxy argument. This relentless daily conditioning over decades had profound potential outcomes for the American psyche and domestic communication styles. It trained millions of loyal listeners to entirely suppress direct emotional confrontation. When an entire culture consumes thousands of hours of media where the most catastrophic relationship events are discussed exclusively through heavy subtext, the culture inevitably begins to mirror the media. You start to see this fascinating phenomenon reflected in the historical data of marriage counseling and family therapy during the mid-20th century. Therapists and early relationship researchers noted that struggling couples would frequently come into their clinical offices completely unable to articulate their fundamental relational incompatibilities. Instead of addressing their profound lack of intimacy or financial betrayal, they would argue endlessly and passionately about the precise way to fold household linens or the proper temperature to serve a Sunday roast. They were essentially acting out daytime radio scripts in their real lives, completely blind to the fact that they were utilizing a corporate-mandated, heavily censored communication style to manage their own deeply personal real-world trauma. Furthermore, the spoken word was only half the battle in this elaborate ruse. The soundscape of the radio drama was equally weaponized to complete the spoken divorce journey. The Foley artists, the men and women creating live sound effects right there in the broadcasting studio, were essential architects of this hidden language. If a leading character could not legally announce she was leaving her toxic husband forever, the Foley artist had to communicate the absolute permanence of her exit entirely through sound. The specific way a wooden door was shut became a highly complex emotional vocabulary. A slow, lingering click of the latch meant sad resignation and potential return. A sharp, violently reverberating slam meant an irreparable, permanent fracture of the marriage. Listeners across the country learned to closely analyze the exact acoustic properties of fictional footsteps fading down a hallway to determine if a character was ever coming back to the home. The physical sonic environment carried the heavy legal and emotional truths that the spoken dialogue was strictly prohibited from touching. This highly regulated ecosystem of whispers, carefully slammed doors, and geographical proxies functioned incredibly smoothly for nearly a decade. The corporate sponsors were thrilled, the household detergents were selling at record-breaking numbers, and the federal censors were entirely satisfied that the moral sanctity of the American home was being vigorously protected over the public airwaves. But this intense pressure cooker of repressed emotion and narrative restriction was structurally unsustainable. The writers were growing increasingly frustrated with the severe creative limitations, and the audiences were slowly demanding more authentic reflections of their own, increasingly complicated lives as the Great Depression lingered. The delicate facade of the perfect radio marriage was bound to crack. It only took one highly ambitious writer, one incredibly tense live studio session, and a script that pushed the geographical proxy so far past the line of acceptability that it forced the highest network executives into a state of absolute, unprecedented panic. The executives genuinely believed they had built an unbreakable system of narrative censorship, but they vastly underestimated the subversive brilliance of the very writers they had hired to sell soap. In the late fall of 1941, a script was quietly submitted that did not just vaguely hint at a permanent marital fracture. It practically drew a detailed map to the local courthouse using nothing but a terrifyingly calm conversation about a broken pocket watch. When the primary sponsor finally read the finalized draft on the morning of the broadcast, absolute chaos broke loose on the 42nd floor of the CBS headquarters in New York City. The subsequent fallout would fundamentally alter the strict rules of American broadcasting forever. So what exactly was written on page 4 of that infamous history-making script? And why did it cause a senior network vice president to threaten an entire cast of beloved actors with immediate catastrophic termination right before they went live on the air? The script in question belonged to a powerhouse daytime serial, a dominant force in the afternoon broadcasting lineup that held millions of American housewives in absolute rapt attention every single weekday. The scene written on page 4 was, on its surface, a mundane domestic interaction between the two beloved lead characters, whom we will refer to as Arthur and Margaret. According to the typed dialogue, Arthur was standing in the foyer of their home, packing a small leather valise. He was holding his grandfather's antique gold pocket watch, an item that had been heavily established over 3 years of broadcasting as the ultimate symbol of his family lineage and his personal integrity. Margaret stood across the room. The dialogue dictated that Arthur look at the watch, tell Margaret that the mainspring was fundamentally shattered, and declare that the internal mechanisms were so violently damaged that no jeweler in the country could ever put it back together. He then announced he was taking the watch on a long train ride to a distant city to leave it with a specialist permanently. Margaret was to reply, in a deadpan whisper, that some broken things should simply be left in the dark and never spoken of again. To the untrained eye, this was a conversation about horology, but to the highly conditioned American listening public, and more importantly, to the terrified executives at the Columbia Broadcasting System, this was a brazen, unmasked declaration of a hostile divorce. The watch was the marriage. The shattered mainspring was the destruction of their marital vows, heavily implying infidelity that could never be repaired. The train ride was the geographical proxy for filing legal separation papers, and Margaret's chilling final line was an acknowledgement of their total emotional death. Historical trends in script analysis reveal that writers have been pushing the boundaries for years, but this specific scene stripped away the protective layer of deniability. It was too aggressive, too precise, and entirely too real. When the senior vice president of daytime programming read the final mimeographed copy of the script just 45 minutes before the live broadcast, he immediately recognized the catastrophic potential outcomes. During this era, network executives lived in perpetual terror of the Federal Communications Commission and the powerful religious leagues that monitored the airwaves for any breach of the moral turpitude clauses. A script this overtly simulating a harsh marital abandonment could trigger immediate federal fines, prompt conservative boycotts against the soap company sponsoring the program, and ultimately cost the network millions of dollars in advertising revenue. The executive bypassed the standard chain of command, sprinting out of his corner office, descending the elevators, and bursting through the heavy soundproof doors of the live studio just as the cast was taking their places around the towering ribbon microphones. Imagine, if you will, a modern American citizen named Jessica in the year 2026. Jessica is a highly successful digital entrepreneur whose entire livelihood, healthcare, and mortgage depend on a single social media platform's algorithm. Imagine if an executive from that tech conglomerate suddenly materialized in her home office, explicitly threatening to permanently delete her digital identity, seize her bank accounts, and blacklist her from the internet entirely if she used a specific metaphor in her next live stream. The sheer existential panic Jessica would feel in 2026 is exactly what those radio actors experienced in that studio in 1941. The tail end of the Great Depression was still a vivid, haunting reality. Losing a network radio contract meant financial ruin. The vice president stood before the cast and the live orchestra, his face flushed with rage, and delivered a stark ultimatum. He demanded they alter the script on the spot, to soften the dialogue, to have Arthur promise he would return by Sunday, to assure the audience that the watch could eventually be fixed. He explicitly threatened that if they delivered the scene as written, every single person in the room, from the lead actress down to the Foley artist holding the leather valise, would be fired before they even stepped out of the building. The studio descended into a tense, suffocating silence. The director, a seasoned veteran of the theater, looked at the actors. They were incredibly protective of their characters and deeply resentful of the constant corporate meddling that forced them to play out sterilized, emotionally dishonest narratives. The writer, watching from the control booth behind the glass, refused to pick up the studio telephone to offer a rewrite. With less than 90 seconds to air, the glowing red bulb above the studio door illuminated. The on-air sign flashed. The live organist, his hands trembling slightly, struck the heavy melancholic minor chords of the show's iconic theme song. The vice president, legally unable to physically intervene once the broadcast had begun without causing an even larger public scandal, was forced to step back into the shadows of the studio, his face a mask of absolute fury. Case studies of early broadcasting anomalies indicate that live performance under extreme duress often produces historically unprecedented art. When the actors stepped up to the microphone to perform page 4, they did not just read the lines, they weaponized them. They channeled all the terror, defiance, and repressed anxiety of that pre-show confrontation directly into the dialogue. Arthur's voice cracked with a devastating, agonizing finality as he described the broken mainspring. Margaret delivered her line about leaving broken things in the dark, not with a melodramatic sigh, but with a cold, terrifying emptiness that resonated through the AM frequencies and into millions of American living rooms. And then, the Foley artist executed the most crucial element of the entire rebellion. Instead of a standard brisk footsteps and door close sound effect, he created an agonizingly slow, echoing walk across the wooden floorboards, followed by the heavy, definitive slam of a solid oak door that rattled the very limits of the broadcasting microphones. He let the ensuing dead silence hang over the live national airwaves for 5 agonizing seconds. In 1941 radio, 5 seconds of dead air was an eternity. It was a gaping, terrifying void that communicated absolute relationship death. The broadcast ended. The actors stepped back from the microphones, fully expecting to be escorted out of the building by network security. The vice president stormed out of the studio to immediately contact the corporate lawyers and prepare for the inevitable wrath of the Federal Communications Commission and the soap conglomerate that funded their paychecks. He was preparing statements of apology, drafting termination letters, and bracing for a total public relations nightmare. But then, the enormous bank of telephones in the network switchboard room began to ring. It was not just a few calls, it was an absolute avalanche. The circuits jammed within minutes. The operators were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of long-distance calls pouring in from housewives in Ohio, factory workers in Michigan, and families in California. The network executives braced themselves for the furious backlash from conservative moral watchdogs, fully expecting demands for cancellation. But the voices on the other end of the line were not angry. They were utterly devastated, profoundly moved, and for the first time in broadcasting history, demanding something entirely different. The audience reaction was so swift and so utterly unprecedented that it completely derailed the executives' termination plans and forced the advertising agencies to fundamentally rewrite the psychological playbook of American marketing. So, what exactly did millions of weeping American listeners say to those switchboard operators? And how did their visceral reaction force the birth of a deeply manipulative, highly lucrative new form of psychological warfare that would permanently alter the way we package and consume domestic trauma? The voices on the other end of those jammed switchboards in late 1941 were not members of conservative decency leagues demanding immediate censorship or threatening massive sponsor boycotts. They were millions of ordinary American housewives, calling in from isolated farmhouses in the Midwest, cramped tenement apartments in Brooklyn, and sprawling suburban developments across the West Coast. These women were weeping. They were pouring their hearts out to exhausted, minimum-wage teenage telephone operators, confessing the deeply held secrets of their own failing marriages. When Margaret spoke of leaving broken things in the dark, and when the Foley artist slammed that heavy oak door, it pierced straight through the superficial, highly regulated veil of early broadcasting etiquette and struck a massive, exposed nerve in the American public. Listeners called to say they entirely understood the broken watch. They called to say their own husbands had mentally packed their bags years ago. They called to express a profound, overwhelming sense of relief that the suffocating, unacknowledged reality of their own domestic misery had finally been articulated, even if it was thinly veiled behind the technical language of horology. For the very first time in mass media history, the silent, pervasive epidemic of relational fracture was validated on a national scale. When the furious network vice president stormed into the switchboard room to assess the anticipated damage and begin drafting his letters of termination, he was confronted with an entirely different reality. Historical trends in broadcast analytics from this era show that negative feedback typically resulted in an immediate dip in sponsor sales and audience drop-off. But the data flowing in over the next 48 hours told a staggering story. The audience retention for that specific program skyrocketed to unprecedented levels. The sheer volume of mail delivered to the local affiliate stations doubled overnight. The soap conglomerate sponsoring the broadcast, initially paralyzed by the fear of a moral crusade against their products, suddenly realized they were sitting on a goldmine of unprecedented audience engagement. The executives and the advertising agencies looked at the data and experienced a massive paradigm shift. They recognized that tapping into raw, unresolved, and relatable domestic trauma did not alienate the consumer. On the contrary, it forged a parasocial bond so intense and so deeply personal that the listener became fiercely, almost irrationally loyal to the program and, by direct extension, to the consumer goods being advertised during the commercial breaks. This sudden realization birthed a deeply manipulative and highly lucrative new form of psychological warfare within American marketing. Prior to this exact moment, daytime serials were largely designed to be aspirational, romantic escapes, focusing on wealthy families, dramatic amnesia, or exotic, far-flung adventures. But the Broken Watch incident provided a radical new case study in consumer psychology. The advertising agencies immediately instructed their massive teams of scriptwriters to completely pivot their creative strategies. They began systematically engineering the spoken divorce journey, not as a necessary evil to bypass federal censors, but as a primary narrative engine deliberately designed to exploit the emotional vulnerability of their target demographic. They built veritable script factories, utilizing massive narrative charts that meticulously tracked the emotional peaks and valleys of a failing fictional marriage. They understood fundamentally that a woman experiencing the slow, agonizing decay of her own real-world marriage was desperately seeking a mirror for her pain, and if they could provide that mirror every afternoon at 2 o'clock, they could sell her absolutely anything. Imagine if we look at a modern consumer named Sarah in the year 2026. Sarah is going through a devastating, unspoken separation from her partner of 10 years. She opens her smartphone, and the highly advanced predictive algorithms embedded in her daily applications immediately detect a shift in her vocal tone during phone calls, a change in her geographical location data indicating she is sleeping in a different room, and a sudden increase in late-night, doom-scrolling behavior. Within milliseconds, the algorithm begins targeting her with incredibly specific advertisements for online therapy applications, heavy-weighted blankets for night terrors, and subscription meal delivery services designed exclusively for a household of one. The technology of 2026 weaponizes her deeply private emotional state to drive rapid, frictionless consumer spending, creating a self-fulfilling loop of isolation where the only entity that truly understands her pain is an artificial intelligence trying to sell her a premium subscription. In the early 1940s, the technology was entirely acoustic, but the underlying psychological mechanism was exactly the same. The radio networks became the algorithm. They deliberately crafted long-term storylines of marital decay to foster a deep sense of ambient anxiety and sorrow, and then they strategically interrupted those storylines to offer the psychological cure in the form of household consumer goods. The narrative formula they developed to accomplish this was meticulously structured and ruthlessly executed. Step 1 involved introducing a subtle, almost imperceptible crack in the domestic routine, such as a husband forgetting to ask about his wife's day for 3 consecutive episodes, planting the seed of neglect. Step 2 initiated the proxy argument, where the couple would spend entire weeks fighting viciously over the placement of a new rug in the living room or the cost of groceries, entirely masking their deeper existential and romantic incompatibilities. Step 3 was the extended geographical departure, sending one partner away on an ambiguous business trip to a distant city, creating a lingering dread and the threat of permanent abandonment. Step 4 was the agonizing silence, maintained through heavily delayed mail or unanswered telegrams. By stretching this grueling process over 6 to 8 months of daily broadcasts, the networks created a highly addictive cycle of emotional tension. The listener was essentially held hostage by their own desperate need for closure, tuning in every single day to see if the fictional marriage would finally shatter completely or miraculously heal. During this prolonged period of manufactured emotional crisis, the commercial breaks were carefully produced to provide a stark, comforting contrast to the bleak drama. The audio transition was jarring but highly effective. The gloomy organ music would fade, replaced instantly by upbeat, major-key orchestral swells. The announcer would step in with a warm, authoritative, incredibly reassuring voice, offering an illusion of total control. Your marriage might be unraveling behind closed doors, the implicit messaging suggested, and you might be entirely powerless to stop your husband from taking that permanent train ride. But you possess absolute, total power over the physical environment of your home. You can eradicate dirt. You can wash away stubborn stains. You can maintain the perfect, flawless facade of a functioning household by purchasing this exact brand of cleaning powder. The historical data regarding retail sales during this period is astonishing. The companies that leaned hardest into the spoken divorce journey saw massive, unprecedented revenue spikes that funded entire corporate empires. They were no longer just selling soap flakes. They were selling the psychological comfort of domestic control to a demographic that felt entirely powerless in their deeply fractured personal lives. This strategy was breathtakingly effective, transforming the daily radio soap opera into one of the most profitable and influential entertainment vehicles in human history. The networks had successfully trained an entire generation of American listeners to process their deepest relationship traumas through the rigid lens of consumerism and heavily coded metaphors. They built a massive, unassailable financial empire on the unspoken pain of the American household. However, this meticulously controlled environment of acoustic smoke and mirrors was rapidly heading toward an unavoidable collision with reality. As the global conflict of the Second World War finally came to a close, millions of radically altered men returned to the domestic sphere, bringing with them entirely new psychological traumas that could not possibly be solved by a spotless kitchen floor or a carefully worded conversation about a broken pocket watch. The rigid, polished architecture of the radio drama was suddenly facing total obsolescence. How did the powerful media landscape adapt to the violent emotional shifts of post-war America? And what terrifying new visual mechanics were required when the spoken divorce journey was violently forced to make the perilous leap from the theater of the mind into the unforgiving, brightly lit era of early television? The transition from the amber glow of the radio dial to the harsh, flickering luminescence of the cathode ray tube was not merely a technological upgrade. It was a profound psychological earthquake for the American public. When the spoken divorce journey was violently dragged into the visual realm of early television, the entire foundational architecture of broadcast censorship and psychological marketing faced total collapse. To comprehend the sheer magnitude of this crisis, we must examine the specific historical trends of the immediate post-war era. In 1946, the United States experienced an unprecedented, staggering spike in the national divorce rate. Millions of men returned from overseas entirely transformed by the harrowing realities of global conflict, suffering from profound, unacknowledged psychological traumas. Simultaneously, millions of women who had spent the war years working in factories, managing household finances, and tasting unprecedented independence were suddenly expected to quietly retreat to the kitchen. The delicate, metaphorical radio dialogues concerning broken pocket watches and delayed mail were entirely insufficient to address the volatile, explosive reality of the post-war American living room. The primary weapon of the radio era was the theater of the mind. The acoustic proxy relied entirely on the listener filling in the blank spaces with their own imagination. But television eradicated the protective darkness of the imagination. Suddenly, the audience could see the actors. They could see the cheap plywood sets, the stiff postures, and the terrified expressions of performers who were essentially performing live theater under massive, blindingly hot studio lights. The Foley artist could no longer simply slam a heavy oak door to signify the permanent end of a marriage. The television cameras had to physically show the husband walking to the door, opening it and leaving, which immediately raised terrifying new questions for the network censors. Where was he going? What did his face look like when he left? Was he ever coming back? The ambiguity that protected the advertising conglomerates was entirely destroyed by the objective reality of the camera lens. Imagine a man named Michael living in the year 2026. Michael is a highly successful corporate consultant who has spent the last 5 years conducting his entire professional life through audio-only digital meetings. He has meticulously cultivated an authoritative, calm vocal persona that completely masks his intense social anxiety and the chaotic, disorganized state of his home office. Now imagine if his multinational corporation suddenly implemented a strict, non-negotiable mandate requiring every employee to use immersive, ultra-high-definition, three-dimensional spatial video for all communications, stripping away his ability to hide behind a muted microphone or an audio filter. The sheer vulnerability, the absolute exposure of his physical reality, and the sudden inability to utilize his finely tuned acoustic coping mechanisms would trigger a massive psychological crisis. This is exactly what the soap manufacturers, the scriptwriters, and the network executives experienced, as they desperately tried to migrate their highly lucrative daytime serials from radio to television. They were completely exposed, and their most profitable narrative tool, the invisible marital fracture, was suddenly unviable. To survive this terrifying new visual medium, the media conglomerates had to rapidly invent an entirely new vocabulary of domestic despair. They had to transition from the spoken divorce journey to what media historians might call the choreographed divorce journey. Since the federal broadcasting codes and powerful decency leagues still strictly prohibited the explicit visual depiction of legal marital dissolution, directors and scriptwriters began treating the television soundstage like a highly pressurized chessboard. The emotional distance between a failing couple was no longer communicated through delayed telegrams, but through rigid, deliberate physical blocking. Potential outcomes of this visual shift included training the American public to read body language with the same intense scrutiny they had previously applied to radio sound effects. Let us look at the step-by-step details of these new visual mechanics. Step 1 was the invention of the domestic barrier. Directors would deliberately place large, visually obstructive objects between the husband and wife during scenes of heavy emotional conflict. A massive dining room table, a wide kitchen island, or the high back of a living room sofa became physical manifestations of the legal separation they were forbidden to discuss. Step 2 involved the weaponization of the human gaze. In radio, characters could speak directly to each other while lying about their emotions. In early television, a failing marriage was visually signaled by characters fundamentally refusing to make eye contact. A wife would deliver a heartbreaking monologue about her fading youth while staring intently out a fake studio window, her back completely turned to her husband, who was simultaneously staring down at an unlit cigarette. The audience, heavily conditioned by years of radio subtext, instantly decoded this spatial alienation. They understood that the physical distance in the frame was the exact equivalent of the old geographical proxy of sending a character to South America. Step 3 was perhaps the most iconic and deeply ingrained visual proxy of the mid-20th century: the twin beds. The strict moral codes of the era forbade a married couple from being shown sharing a single marital bed, which inadvertently handed scriptwriters a brilliant visual tool for the spoken divorce journey. By manipulating the physical distance between the two separate beds, or by having one character violently turn off their bedside lamp while the other remained illuminated and staring at the ceiling, directors could communicate a devastating lack of intimacy, profound emotional abandonment, and the total cessation of a romantic relationship without ever uttering a single controversial word. These case studies of early television blocking reveal a massive systematic retraining of the American consumer. The networks were teaching viewers how to perform relationship failure visually. The advertising agencies quickly realized that this new visual tension was just as lucrative, if not more so, than the old radio models. The camera could linger on the pristine, spotless kitchen counters during a devastating argument, subtly reinforcing the core psychological message that while the human heart may be entirely uncontrollable, the domestic environment can be perfectly managed through the purchase of the right chemical cleaners. The visual juxtaposition of intense human suffering against the backdrop of an immaculately sanitized television home drove consumer spending to staggering new heights. Entire corporate empires were built on the silent, agonizing space between two actors refusing to look at each other on a grainy black and white screen. However, the relentless march of time, and the increasingly complex realities of the 1950s meant that this delicate choreography of silent suffering was doomed to fail. The viewing public was growing increasingly sophisticated, and the real-world legal landscape surrounding marriage was beginning to shift beneath the feet of the network censors. The audience was no longer satisfied with separate beds and staring out of windows. They could feel the artificiality of the visual constraints. The pressure within the television studios was building to an absolute boiling point, waiting for a single catalyst to shatter the visual proxies forever. This breaking point did not come from a scriptwriter or a massive corporate mandate. It came from a rogue live television director who made a split-second, highly illegal decision during a massive nationwide broadcast. He instructed his cameraman to slowly push in and completely fill the television screen with an extreme close-up of a specific, forbidden object resting on a mahogany desk. What was this heavily restricted object, and how did this singular rebellious camera movement trigger a massive federal panic, permanently alter the trajectory of American visual media, and finally force the hidden reality of legal divorce into the harsh, undeniable light of the modern era? The forbidden object resting on that mahogany desk under the blistering heat of the studio lighting was not a subtle metaphor. It was a crisp, vividly white envelope bearing the stark, highly legible seal of the Washoe County District Court in Reno, Nevada, with the words "Petition for Dissolution of Marriage" typed impeccably across its center. For nearly 2 decades, the word Reno had been utilized on the radio as a geographical proxy, a whispered destination for exhausted wives suffering from nervous exhaustion. But the radio era relied on plausible deniability. The listening audience could pretend the trip was for a health retreat, and the federal censors could officially log it as a simple vacation storyline. However, the merciless, unforgiving lens of the television camera annihilated that deniability in a fraction of a second. By pushing the camera lens directly into the text of a legal divorce petition, the rogue director committed the ultimate broadcasting sin. He dragged the whispered, shadowy realm of marital destruction out of the theater of the mind and placed it directly into the harsh, undeniable reality of the American living room. The mechanics of this live television rebellion offer a fascinating case study in media history. It was the early 1950s, a period where television was broadcast live across the eastern seaboard. There were no tape delays, no digital safety nets, and no post-production editing rooms to fix a mistake before it reached millions of homes. The network censors physically stood inside the control booth, hovering over the director's shoulder, clutching thick binders of broadcasting regulations. When the director, severely frustrated by months of staging absurd, emotionally stifled arguments across vast living room sets, quietly instructed his cameraman to push in for an extreme close-up of the desk, the censor immediately realized what was happening. Historical accounts from the era describe absolute pandemonium in the control booth. The censor lunged for the control panel, screaming at the technical director to switch to a wide shot, but the technical director hesitated. In that singular, terrifying moment of hesitation, the camera held the shot of the Washoe County divorce petition for 8 agonizing seconds. In the lightning-fast pacing of network television, 8 seconds of silence focused on a banned legal document is an eternity. It was a catastrophic breach of the moral turpitude clause. Imagine if we examine a modern parallel using a citizen named Robert in the year 2026. Robert is utilizing a highly regulated, corporate-controlled virtual reality educational platform. The environment is heavily filtered by advanced artificial intelligence to ensure absolutely no controversial, unsanctioned, or legally ambiguous material ever enters the simulation. Suddenly, the AI fails and a massive, unredacted, highly sensitive federal legal document drops directly into Robert's digital field of vision, freezing his interface and forcing him to read the forbidden text. The profound shock, the immediate realization that the systemic guardrails have been shattered, and the intense visceral thrill of witnessing something entirely forbidden is exactly what those 1950s housewives experienced when that envelope filled their television screens. They were suddenly entirely liberated from the exhausting mental gymnastics of the spoken divorce journey. The subtext was dead. The reality was finally staring them in the face. The immediate fallout was exactly as apocalyptic as the network executives had always feared. The Federal Communications Commission launched an immediate, aggressive inquiry into the broadcast. The powerful decency leagues, who had spent decades meticulously policing the moral purity of the airwaves, mobilized their vast membership networks overnight, flooding the corporate headquarters of the soap manufacturers with tens of thousands of angry telegrams demanding the immediate cancellation of the program and the permanent blacklisting of the director. The network vice president scrambled to draft frantic public apologies, claiming the camera movement was a technical malfunction, a terrible mistake caused by a malfunctioning piece of studio equipment. They prepared to terminate the entire production staff, entirely convinced that this blatant visual confirmation of legal marital failure would destroy their advertising revenue and alienate the conservative American consumer base forever. But then, the most crucial historical trend of the 20th century media landscape violently reasserted itself. The network executives looked at the overnight Nielsen ratings, a newly developed system for tracking television viewership, and what they saw completely paralyzed their termination plans. The viewership for the episode following the envelope incident did not plummet. It skyrocketed to unprecedented historical heights. The audience had not tuned out in moral outrage. They had tuned in by the millions, utterly desperate to see what would happen now that the ultimate domestic taboo had been breached. The American public, exhausted by the pristine, sanitized, deeply artificial representations of family life that dominated early television, was fiercely hungry for reality. They wanted the mess. They wanted the legal confrontation. They wanted to see the emotional devastation of a marriage collapsing in real time, completely devoid of geographical proxies or broken pocket watches. The massive soap conglomerates, initially terrified by the federal threats, experienced a rapid and profound ideological shift when they cross-referenced the staggering television ratings with their retail sales data. The potential outcomes were incredibly clear. The visual confirmation of a legal divorce was generating a massive, highly engaged female audience, and that audience was purchasing cleaning supplies, cosmetics, and household appliances at a rate that dwarfed the sales generated during the radio era. The intense anxiety and visceral drama produced by watching a legal separation unfold visually proved to be the ultimate catalyst for consumer spending. The advertising executives realized that keeping the American housewife in a state of perpetual anxiety about her own marriage was incredibly profitable, but showing her the exact legal mechanics of how a marriage ends was a veritable goldmine. This brutal economic reality permanently altered the trajectory of American visual media. The networks quietly pushed back against the decency leagues. They hired aggressive legal teams to renegotiate the broadcasting codes with the Federal Communications Commission, arguing that television had a civic duty to accurately reflect the changing sociological realities of the modern American family. They systematically dismantled the heavily choreographed visual proxies. The twin beds were slowly pushed together, the massive physical barriers in the living room sets were removed, and the characters were finally allowed to look each other directly in the eyes while discussing alimony, child custody, and the division of marital assets. The spoken divorce journey was officially buried, replaced by a devastating new era of visual confrontation. However, dragging the hidden reality of legal divorce into the harsh light of television required an entirely new narrative architecture. You could no longer sustain a daily drama simply by having two characters avoid each other or stare silently at legal documents. The confrontation had to be sustained, stretched out, and highly monetized over years of broadcasting. To achieve this, the network scriptwriters had to invent a completely new type of character. They needed an antagonist that the radio era had never dared to introduce, a figure who could legally and emotionally weaponize the divorce process to keep the audience completely addicted to the screen. Who was this terrifying new television archetype, and how did the introduction of this singular character fundamentally rewrite the way the American public perceives the legal system, transforming the sterile environment of the courtroom into the ultimate gladiatorial arena of domestic warfare? The terrifying new television archetype that emerged from the ashes of the geographical proxy was the ruthless, meticulously calculating, and morally ambiguous family law litigator. To truly understand the magnitude of this shift, we must examine historical trends in broadcasting prior to the 1950s. During the radio era, legal professionals were almost exclusively portrayed as benevolent, grandfatherly figures. They were the trusted community pillars who drafted simple wills, quietly fixed property disputes, and offered sage, gentle advice over a cup of black coffee. But the moment the Washoe County divorce petition shattered the visual barrier, the network scriptwriters faced a massive structural dilemma. A legal separation is, at its core, a bureaucratic process, and bureaucracy is incredibly difficult to monetize on daily television. The writers could not simply show a couple signing papers and moving on. They needed to replace the agonizing, months-long suspense of the delayed telegram with an entirely new engine of prolonged, agonizing conflict. They achieved this by transforming the sterile, administrative environment of the civil courtroom into a vicious, high-stakes gladiatorial arena, and they anointed the divorce attorney as the supreme architect of domestic destruction. This required a step-by-step mechanical overhaul of daytime narrative structure. Because the United States legal system at this time operated almost entirely on a fault-based divorce model, a couple could not simply dissolve their union due to incompatibility. One party had to legally prove that the other was entirely at fault, utilizing claims of extreme mental cruelty, physical abandonment, or egregious infidelity. This harsh legal reality was an absolute goldmine for television writers. The legal discovery process immediately became the brand new spoken divorce journey. Step 1 of this new narrative formula involved the weaponized ambush. Instead of a husband packing a suitcase in the foyer, the audience would watch a fast-talking process server publicly humiliate the protagonist at a crowded social event, handing over a thick stack of aggressively worded legal injunctions. Step 2 was the deposition, which brilliantly replaced the passive-aggressive living room arguments of the past. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of a fictional law office, the ruthless attorney would surgically interrogate the weeping spouse, twisting perfectly innocent memories into malicious, legally binding accusations. Step 3 involved the ultimate emotional leverage, the introduction of brutal, zero-sum custody threats, and the aggressive freezing of all marital assets, designed to leave the protagonist financially and psychologically paralyzed. Case studies of early television melodramas reveal that these specific legal sequences were stretched out to agonizing lengths. A single deposition scene could be meticulously dissected and broadcast over the course of 3 entire weeks. The ruthless attorney would pace around the long mahogany conference table, deploying highly sophisticated psychological warfare to break the opposing party. They would introduce surprise witnesses, unveil forged financial ledgers, and dredge up decades-old perceived slights to legally prove fault. The audience was absolutely mesmerized. The television networks had successfully trained the American public to view the dissolution of a marriage not as a tragic, private sorrow, but as a blood sport requiring highly paid legal mercenaries. This generated unprecedented, explosive viewership ratings. The viewing public tuned in obsessively to learn the tactical language of injunctions, subpoenas, and restraining orders, absorbing a highly dramatized adversarial view of the justice system. Imagine if a modern individual named Marcus in the year 2026 is navigating a difficult separation. Marcus opens his digital inbox to find that an autonomous, heavily weaponized legal algorithm hired by his estranged partner has already automatically frozen his cryptocurrency wallets, preemptively locked his biometric access to his own smart vehicle, and filed 3 simultaneous restraining orders based on digitally altered voice notes. The absolute suffocating terror and the profound feeling of being crushed by a cold, calculating, inescapable system that Marcus would experience in 2026 is precisely the psychological state that the network writers intentionally induced in the 1950s Housewife. They made the legal system look like an unstoppable, terrifying monster that could reach into your private sanctuary and legally strip you of your children, your home, and your dignity. This manufactured terror was highly synergistic with the advertising models of the era. The commercial breaks during these intense courtroom battles were masterclasses in psychological contrast. A viewer would watch a fictional mother being relentlessly berated by a hostile attorney, driven to the brink of a complete mental collapse under cross-examination. The screen would fade to black and instantly, a cheerful, brightly lit commercial would appear, featuring a serene, perfectly coiffed woman effortlessly gliding a brand new vacuum cleaner over a spotless carpet. The psychological messaging was explicit and incredibly powerful. The outside world, specifically the legal system, is a chaotic, terrifying, and utterly destructive force that will tear you apart if your marriage fails. The only place you have absolute sanctuary, the only environment where you possess total control and safety, is within the meticulously cleaned, heavily consumer-driven walls of your current home. The potential outcomes of this marketing strategy were staggering. Consumer spending on household appliances and cleaning supplies reached historical peaks, driven entirely by the ambient anxiety generated by fictional family court proceedings. However, the historical trends demonstrate that when mass media artificially inflates and distorts a legal process for entertainment and profit, that distortion inevitably leaks out of the television screen and infects real-world behavior. By the early 1960s, family law practitioners across the United States began reporting a terrifying shift in the attitudes of their actual clients. Couples who might have previously settled their differences through quiet mediation were suddenly walking into law offices demanding absolute, theatrical destruction of their spouses. They were adopting the aggressive, punitive language they heard every afternoon on the television. They expected their real-life attorneys to act like the ruthless, unyielding gladiators they saw on screen. The legal system was becoming suffocated by highly adversarial, deeply bitter fault-based divorce proceedings that dragged on for years, burning through actual family savings and inflicting severe, lasting psychological trauma on an entire generation of children caught in the crossfire. The television networks had inadvertently turned the American public into highly aggressive amateur litigators, completely destabilizing the real-world family court system. This toxic, heavily monetized feedback loop between television drama and actual courtroom chaos was building immense, unsustainable cultural pressure. The legal requirement to prove fault in order to escape a marriage was destroying real families and clogging the judicial system, while simultaneously generating billions of dollars in advertising revenue for the media conglomerates who exploited that pain. The entire system was perched on a knife's edge, waiting for a massive structural revolution. The soap operas had pushed the legal boundaries so far into the realm of pure, unadulterated cruelty that a massive legislative backlash was entirely inevitable. A quiet, heavily organized political movement was brewing on the West Coast, aiming to completely strip the theatrical vengeance out of marital dissolution forever. This movement would introduce a radical, unprecedented piece of legislation that threatened to destroy the very narrative engine the television networks had spent a decade perfecting. What was this revolutionary legal concept? And how did a rising, highly influential political figure named Ronald Reagan inadvertently trigger the absolute collapse of the fault-based television drama, forcing the networks to invent a completely new, even darker psychological weapon to keep their audiences hooked? The revolutionary legal concept that completely dismantled the television industry's most profitable narrative engine was the advent of the no-fault divorce. To comprehend the catastrophic impact this had on daytime broadcasting, we must examine the specific historical trends of California politics in the late 1960s. In 1969, then-Governor Ronald Reagan, a man intimately familiar with the brutal optics of Hollywood separations, signed the Family Law Act. This legislation was completely unprecedented in American history. It entirely eradicated the legal necessity to prove marital fault. Suddenly, a spouse did not need to hire a private investigator to document infidelity, nor did they need to sit in a courtroom and vividly recount instances of extreme mental cruelty. They simply had to check a bureaucratic box labeled irreconcilable differences, and the state would grant the dissolution. This legal revolution spread rapidly across the United States, transforming a deeply adversarial, highly public blood sport into a quiet, administrative paperwork process. For the average American citizen, this was a monumental relief, but for the network executives and the soap opera scriptwriters, it was an absolute, unmitigated disaster. The legal reform had essentially rendered their entire creative playbook obsolete overnight. You cannot build a multi-million-dollar daytime television empire, stretch a storyline over 9 months of daily broadcasting, and sell premium household cleaning products against the backdrop of 2 reasonable adults quietly signing an administrative form and amicably dividing their assets. The writers' rooms across New York and Los Angeles were thrown into absolute panic. The external villain, the terrifying predatory family law litigator who had driven ratings for a decade, was suddenly legally irrelevant. The networks desperately needed a replacement. If the law no longer forced husbands and wives to destroy each other in a public courtroom, the writers realized they had to force them to destroy each other in the terrifying, inescapable privacy of their own minds. This realization birthed a completely new, infinitely darker psychological weapon in American media: the weaponization of domestic reality. The television networks pivoted from legal thrillers to psychological horror. They began producing storylines deeply rooted in severe psychological manipulation, cognitive distortion, and what we now recognize clinically as gaslighting. Since the characters could legally leave at any time without proving fault, the writers had to invent deeply complex, highly toxic emotional tethers that paralyzed the protagonist and prevented them from walking out the front door. Step 1 of this new narrative structure was the isolation phase. The audience would watch in horror as a charming, seemingly perfect husband methodically and quietly severed his wife from her support systems, intercepting her mail, alienating her friends, and convincing her family that she was suffering from severe mental instability. Step 2 was the deliberate distortion of physical reality. Case studies of late 1960s and early 1970s daytime serials reveal a terrifying trend where writers would instruct actors to perform microscopic acts of domestic sabotage. A husband would deliberately move a set of car keys, deny ever touching them, and then calmly watch his wife spiral into a frantic, tearful panic, questioning her own basic memory and sanity. He would subtly alter the dosage of her prescribed medication, or hire an actor to make terrifying, silent phone calls to the house while he was conveniently sitting in the same room, pretending he could not hear the ringing. Step 3 was the false rescue, where the architect of this psychological torture would suddenly step in as the benevolent savior, comforting the very woman he was actively destroying, effectively convincing her that the outside world was entirely dangerous and he was her only safe harbor. The courtroom was gone, but the domestic space had been transformed into a maximum security prison of the mind. Imagine, if you will, a modern American citizen named Emily living in the year 2026. Emily is attempting to navigate a deteriorating relationship with a partner who controls the central administrative access to their fully integrated smart home. Imagine the absolute terror Emily experiences when the environmental temperature drops to freezing in the middle of the night, the digital locks on the exterior doors randomly cycle open and shut, and her personal artificial intelligence assistant plays distorted audio of her own voice saying things she never recorded. When she confronts her partner, he pulls up the immutable blockchain-verified digital logs that show absolutely zero system anomalies, calmly suggesting with a look of profound pity that her severe stress is causing visual and auditory hallucinations. The suffocating, deeply isolating terror that Emily would experience in 2026 trapped in a digital reality she can no longer trust, is the exact psychological state the network television writers actively engineered for their viewers 50 years ago, using nothing but analog rotary phones and misplaced house keys. The potential outcomes of broadcasting this deeply insidious psychological warfare into millions of American homes every afternoon were incredibly complex and highly lucrative. The advertising agencies, always agile and ruthlessly observant, immediately recognized the shift in the audience's anxiety. The viewers were no longer terrified of a judge banging a gavel. They were terrified of losing their own minds. They were terrified of the enemy sleeping in the twin bed next to them. Consequently, the commercial breaks underwent a massive, highly calculated evolution. The cheerful advertisements for vacuum cleaners and laundry detergents slowly began to share airtime with a completely new category of consumer products. The networks began heavily advertising over-the-counter nerve tonics, mild sedatives, and tension relief medications. They marketed high-end, heavily locked diaries, personal security devices, and cosmetics that were specifically branded not just for beauty, but as a form of psychological armor, a way to maintain a flawless external facade while internally collapsing. Historical trends from this era show a massive spike in the sales of pop psychology books and self-help manuals, driven entirely by an audience that had been conditioned by television to constantly analyze their spouses for hidden sociopathic tendencies. The networks had successfully monetized domestic paranoia. They trained the American public to view the home not as a sanctuary, but as a hostile environment requiring constant, exhausting vigilance. However, the sheer intensity of this psychological narrative could not be contained within the boundaries of fictional soap operas forever. The American viewing public, now highly educated in the language of emotional manipulation, cognitive distortion, and toxic relationship dynamics, began to crave a new level of authenticity. They were growing tired of watching highly paid actors perform these psychological breakdowns on cheap studio sets. They wanted the raw, unscripted reality of human suffering. As the 1970s bled into the 1980s, a completely new broadcasting format emerged, one that looked at the highly profitable architecture of the fictional psychological thriller and decided to deploy it using actual real-life American citizens. This new format would entirely blur the line between entertainment and exploitation, turning the spoken divorce journey into a blood-soaked public coliseum. How did a seemingly innocent local broadcasting experiment transform into a multi-billion-dollar daytime talk show industry? And how did these specific programs weaponize the live studio audience to permanently destroy the concept of private marital dignity in the United States? The local broadcasting experiment that catalyzed this catastrophic shift began in the American Midwest during the late 1960s, but it did not reach its terrifying, highly weaponized apex until the sweeping syndication booms of the 1980s and 1990s. The daytime talk show was initially pitched to television executives and federal regulators as a modern electronic town hall, a democratic, highly civilized space where everyday citizens could discuss pressing sociological issues. However, historical trends in audience retention quickly and brutally demonstrated that intellectual, nuanced discourse yielded absolutely abysmal ratings. What generated astronomical, history-making viewership was raw, unfiltered psychological vivisection. The producers realized that the American public, heavily conditioned by decades of fictional soap opera betrayals, possessed an insatiable, deeply voyeuristic appetite for domestic destruction. But highly paid actors reciting memorized scripts had a ceiling of authenticity. To shatter that ceiling and push consumer engagement to unprecedented heights, the networks began recruiting actual, deeply fractured American couples, flying them away from their local communities to massive metropolitan studios, and placing them under the unforgiving, hyper-focused glare of the national spotlight. The spoken divorce journey was no longer a coded, metaphorical conversation about a broken pocket watch or a carefully choreographed, silent dance across a fictional living room set. It was violently transformed into a high-decibel public confession. Let us thoroughly examine the step-by-step mechanical design of these early talk show sets, because every single physical and acoustic element was deliberately engineered to extract maximum emotional volatility from non-professional citizens. The host of the program, armed with a handheld microphone, constantly prowled the aisles, acting simultaneously as a benevolent faux therapist, an aggressive prosecuting attorney, and a relentless circus ringmaster. The feuding couple was seated on an elevated platform, deliberately positioned to strip them of their spatial autonomy, effectively trapping them under blistering hot studio lights with no physical route of escape. But the most devastating, highly innovative weapon in this new television arsenal was not the host, the lighting, or the rolling cameras. It was the live studio audience. For the first 50 years of American broadcasting history, the audience was an invisible, passive, and entirely silent consumer sitting thousands of miles away in the safety of their private living rooms. The daytime talk show format fundamentally altered this dynamic by dragging the audience directly into the gladiatorial arena and handing them the metaphorical sword. Producers would explicitly instruct the live crowd before the cameras ever rolled, establishing rigid psychological cues and behavioral expectations. They were aggressively trained to act as the ultimate moral arbiters of the American public. When a guest confessed to financial infidelity, emotional abandonment, or a secret separation, the audience was actively encouraged by floor managers to gasp loudly, to boo mercilessly, and to hurl aggressive, highly personal, unscripted insults directly at the stage. This collective, heavily amplified vocal judgment completely obliterated the long-standing concept of private marital dignity. The profound, quiet, and deeply personal tragedy of a failing marriage was instantly commodified into a public execution. The couple on stage was no longer trying to solve their irreconcilable differences or navigate the legal complexities of asset division. They were desperately, hopelessly trying to win the favor of a screaming, bloodthirsty mob of complete strangers. Case studies of early daytime television demographics reveal that this format tapped into a profound societal rage, allowing the audience to project their own unresolved domestic frustrations onto the designated villain sitting on the stage. Imagine, if you will, a modern American citizen named David in the year 2026. David and his spouse are attempting to navigate a deeply painful, highly complex legal separation involving the division of a small digital business and incredibly sensitive child custody arrangements. Now imagine if, instead of entering a quiet, confidential mediation room with a licensed professional, David is legally and contractually required to broadcast his most vulnerable, agonizing relationship arguments via live, unencrypted augmented reality stream to a digital stadium of 200 anonymous citizens. Imagine those citizens possess interactive biometric keypads, instantly projecting their harsh, unfiltered moral judgments, jeers, and aggressive personal attacks directly onto David's retinal display in real time while he stammers, trying to explain his side of the marital collapse. The absolute suffocating terror of that immediate, unyielding public shaming, the profound psychological damage of having your personal reality dismantled by a mob, is precisely the terrifying environment the daytime talk show successfully normalized on a massive national scale. The potential outcomes of this ruthless broadcasting strategy were economically staggering. By converting private domestic trauma into a daily public spectator sport, these syndicated programs completely monopolized daytime television viewership. However, an analysis of the advertising models from this specific era reveals a fascinating, deeply cynical corporate pivot. Because the content on screen was so undeniably raw, unpredictable, and often centered around profound personal shame, the traditional blue-chip sponsors who previously sold luxury household appliances, premium baking flours, and expensive floor waxes initially fled the time slots in terror. They were rapidly replaced by an entirely new, highly predatory ecosystem of direct-to-consumer advertising. The commercial breaks interrupting these televised screaming matches became completely flooded with advertisements for aggressive personal injury attorneys, subprime debt consolidation services, at-home genetic testing kits, and rapid weight loss supplements. The core psychological messaging of the advertising industry had radically mutated. The television was no longer promising the American housewife that she could maintain the perfect, flawless facade of a clean home. It was directly telling the viewer that their personal life was fundamentally broken, their intimate relationships were inherently toxic, their bodies were flawed, and they desperately needed rapid, aggressive legal or chemical intervention to survive the chaos of modern existence. The networks were actively funding the destruction of the family unit, and then immediately selling the desperate viewers the tools to sue each other. This generated a highly toxic, inescapable, self-sustaining feedback loop. As more and more clone programs flooded the syndication market to capture the massive advertising revenue, the competition for the American viewer's daily attention became ruthlessly fierce. A standard, relatable marital separation or a quiet, tearful confession of infidelity was no longer shocking enough to sustain the necessary ratings. The producers were forced into a terrifying rapid arms race of human degradation. To keep the live studio audience screaming and the millions of viewers at home entirely paralyzed in front of their screens, the spoken divorce journey had to become increasingly bizarre, highly confrontational, and deeply pathological. The talk show bookers scoured the country for extreme deviance. They introduced highly convoluted secret double lives, utilized massive theatrical manila envelopes to reveal shocking paternity test results on live television, and intentionally staged aggressive surprise confrontations in the studio, deliberately designing environments where a violent physical altercation between a husband and wife was not just a possibility, but a highly desired outcome. The physical brawls, restrained by enormous, heavily muscled security guards, became the absolute pinnacle of daytime entertainment. The sociological impact on the American family was profound and deeply damaging. An entire generation of citizens was being actively, daily conditioned to believe that loud, public, highly aggressive confrontation was the only authentic, valid way to resolve domestic conflict. The quiet dignity of walking away, the nuanced, deeply private discussions of a failing legal union, and the respectful dissolution of a family were entirely erased from the dominant media landscape, replaced by the mandatory, heavily monetized screaming match. The talk show industrial complex had successfully convinced the American public that their deepest, most agonizing personal traumas were completely worthless, unless they were being loudly broadcast and judged for mass entertainment. But eventually, historical trends dictate that even the most extreme psychological stimuli lose their potency. By the late 1990s, even the physical studio brawls and the screaming audiences began to lose their shocking, magnetic edge. The daytime talk show format reached its absolute cultural saturation point, and the viewers were developing a profound, cynical immunity to the manufactured one-hour bursts of outrage. The massive media conglomerates realized that confining real people to a single soundstage for a 60-minute interview was simply too restrictive, too artificial. They needed to capture the domestic destruction 24 hours a day. They needed to remove the host, completely remove the live studio audience, and physically embed the television cameras directly inside the private American home, permanently erasing the final, fragile boundary between private suffering and public consumption. How did a massive, industry-crippling writer's strike and a sudden, desperate network demand for infinitely cheap programming birth the terrifying, deeply manipulative era of modern reality television? And how did this ultimate, inescapable evolution of the spoken divorce journey finally shatter our collective perception of what is real, and what is a heavily edited, highly produced lie? The massive, industry-crippling writer's strike of 1988 was the precise historical catalyst that fundamentally shattered the existing television landscape and birthed the modern era of unscripted domestic surveillance. Faced with the terrifying prospect of months of dead air and hemorrhaging advertising revenue, network executives desperately needed programming that was incredibly cheap to produce and completely bypassed the powerful labor unions. They looked at the astronomical ratings of the daytime talk shows and realized the core truth of American media consumption. The public did not care about professional actors or polished scripts. They wanted raw, unfiltered human wreckage. But the talk show format was limited by its rigid 60-minute studio constraint. The executives asked a terrifying question. What if we removed the host, completely eliminated the live studio audience, and physically embedded the television cameras directly inside the private American home 24 hours a day? This decision initiated the ultimate, inescapable evolution of the spoken divorce journey. By moving the cameras directly into the domestic space, the networks achieved something the radio censors of the 1930s could never have possibly imagined. They transformed the sanctuary of the home into a permanent, highly pressurized psychological panopticon. Case studies of early reality television production reveal a deeply manipulative psychological screening process. Casting directors did not look for well-adjusted couples. They actively administered rigorous personality tests to identify profound historical trauma, extreme narcissistic tendencies, and deeply incompatible communication styles. They deliberately selected couples who were already teetering on the absolute edge of relational collapse, signed them to ironclad, multi-year broadcasting contracts, and then locked them inside a house surrounded by an army of camera operators. The sheer physical presence of the television camera fundamentally alters human behavior, creating a toxic feedback loop known as the observer effect. When a struggling couple is acutely aware that their every movement, sigh, and argument is being recorded for national consumption, the marital conflict instantly mutates from genuine pain into performative theater. The arguments become louder, the betrayals are actively staged for maximum visual impact, and the concept of private reconciliation is entirely destroyed because quiet forgiveness does not generate high television ratings. The network successfully monetized the complete destruction of marital dignity, but the true horror of this new era was not what happened in front of the cameras. It was the deeply deceptive surgical manipulation that occurred inside the windowless, heavily fortified editing bays. To comprehend how this heavily produced lie became accepted as reality, You must understand a specific, highly secretive post-production technique, known within the industry as the Frankenbite. Reality television is an absolute logistical nightmare, generating thousands of hours of incredibly boring, mundane footage. To craft the high-stakes narrative of a failing marriage, audio editors meticulously comb through months of dialogue, isolating individual words and syllables spoken by the couple in completely different contexts. They will take a sentence a husband spoke in March about a frustrating traffic jam, digitally splice it together with a sigh he let out in April, and attach it to an angry glare he gave in May. The final broadcasted result is a completely fabricated sentence where he appears to be aggressively threatening his wife with an impending legal separation. The audience hears the spoken divorce journey loud and clear, completely oblivious to the fact that the entire interaction was mechanically engineered on a digital timeline. Imagine a highly connected individual named Daniel in the year 2026. Daniel installs a state-of-the-art, fully autonomous smart home system that records all audio and visual data to optimize his domestic environment. Now imagine if the proprietary artificial intelligence managing that system gets hacked by a malicious third party during a tense, unspoken trial separation from his partner. The artificial intelligence takes 3 weeks of completely innocuous conversations, digitally isolates Daniel's vocal tones, and perfectly reconstructs a terrifying, hyper-realistic video file where Daniel appears to be aggressively admitting to massive financial fraud and infidelity. The sheer, suffocating terror of watching a high-definition recording of yourself saying horrific things you never actually said, and knowing that your family, the legal system, and the public will believe the footage over your own memory, is the exact psychological violence the television networks perfected in the early 2000s. They proved that reality is not what actually happens. Reality is entirely defined by whoever controls the final edit. The potential outcomes of this sustained, decades-long manipulation of the American viewing public have been sociologically catastrophic. By relentlessly broadcasting these heavily edited, highly pathological relationships and labeling them as reality, the media conglomerates fundamentally warped our collective baseline for human behavior. We watched marriages spectacularly implode on national television, fueled by manufactured drama and artificial betrayals, and we slowly began to internalize these toxic dynamics as normal. We learned to anticipate catastrophic failure in our own lives because the media trained us that peaceful, quiet relationships are inherently flawed or deeply boring. The spoken divorce journey, which began as a terrified whisper about a broken pocket watch in a 1930s radio studio, evolved into a screaming match on a talk show stage, and finally mutated into a surgically constructed digital live broadcast into millions of homes. This historical trend fundamentally destroyed our collective perception of what is authentic. When you observe a couple arguing today, or when you attempt to navigate the devastating, complex realities of a legal separation, you are not simply acting on your own independent emotions. You are unknowingly acting out nearly a century of highly engineered, corporate-funded media conditioning. You are speaking the language invented by terrified radio executives, performing the body language designed by television directors, and anticipating the dramatic, catastrophic legal fallout engineered by reality television producers. The media of the past meticulously designed the conversations of your present, completely stripping away the quiet dignity of human connection and replacing it with a highly profitable, deeply paranoid spectacle. However, the timeline of media manipulation does not end with network reality television. We have now crossed an entirely new, deeply terrifying threshold. The massive broadcast networks no longer hold the monopoly on the camera, and the heavily guarded editing bays have been completely decentralized. The immense, manipulative power to document, edit, and broadcast the destruction of a human relationship has been violently ripped from the hands of the corporate executives and placed directly into the pockets of billions of individual citizens. What happens to the deeply fragile human psyche when the American public becomes their own ruthless reality television producers? How are modern algorithms deliberately engineered to incentivize the catastrophic public broadcasting of our own personal breakups? And how is the rise of the digital influencer divorce about to trigger the most devastating, completely irreversible psychological crisis in the history of human communication?